Hey folks, this is Rhykker with a Path of Exile video on the best starter builds for the upcoming expansion, Affliction. I coordinated with Path of Exile experts Crouching Tuna and Tenkiei from Max Roll to come up with 5 solid starter builds that are great options to begin your Affliction journey on Friday. Plus, each build will have a corresponding Max Roll link. You can follow along with the Max Roll guide. It'll have everything in there that you can possibly need to rock this build and ensure a smooth start of your season. Those links will be in the description below. Now, what makes for a good league starter? This is a build that won't require you to get lucky with drops, or a build that'll need a whole lot of currency in order to trade for gear. These are builds that will scale well with the content as you progress through the campaign and into early mapping. It's going to get you easily into endgame content, but in the far endgame, these builds will be superseded by the best endgame builds. But you can use these builds to farm up all the currency that you need to transition into one of those best builds. Now, whenever we use the word budget, like high budget or low budget, we're talking about trading. We're talking about how much does it cost with regards to trade currency to afford this build. So low budget means with very little effort, you could acquire this via trading. A high budget build would need a lot of currency to trade for the gear that you need. So if you don't want to trade at all, if you want to be solo self-found, you want to look for the lowest budget builds. We'll also talk about clear speed sometimes. This refers to how fast a build will clear maps. This is 95% of what you're going to be doing in PoE in the end game, running maps. You got to get through the campaign first, so you're not going to be doing maps at low level, but it becomes your main activity. Now we'll note that the meta hasn't changed a whole lot since last league when it comes to starter builds. This league is introducing transfigured gems. That's going to be a whole big thing, but those are locked behind Labyrinth. It's going to be something that you access later on. So without further ado, let's dive into our first build, the Toxic Rain Ballista Pathfinder, which is my personal favorite on this list. Toxic Rain is a skill that shoots arrows up in the air, which then rain down upon your enemies as chaos damage pods that deal damage over time. Also, overlapping pods will stack damage. And this build is even better thanks to quality changes to Toxic Rain that will make the pods last longer. So longer pods, meaning you can stack more of them, meaning even more damage. Now there's 2 main ways to run Toxic Rain. There's the Ballista version and the non-Ballista version. We're talking about the Ballista version. With this version, you're going to have up to 6 ballistas that you're going to position around, and they're going to be blasting a million arrows up into the sky, and it's just going to be raining down damage pods all over the screen. This build is a great all-rounder. You can clear pretty much all the content in the game without any real gear investment. And to run this build, you start with the Ranger class, then you move into the Pathfinder Ascendancy class. This Ascendancy focuses on enhancing your flasks, and I think it's just a really cool mechanic. With the Pathfinder Ascendancy, you're going to be able to turn your life flask into a massive recovery buff. And you'll be able to drastically improve the effectiveness of your defensive flasks, which can be really impressive with certain unique flasks. The playstyle is also really safe because you're laying down your turrets, your ballistas, and then you're just running around dodging enemy attacks while the ballistas are doing all the work. Your enemies will also be constantly slowed, making them easier to dodge. It's basically playing keep away while cheating. Now, Toxic Rain, as we said, is a damage over time skill. It's a dot, so there is a bit of that delayed gratification there. I know not everyone enjoys dot builds. Now, when you're up against bosses, you want to make sure you are stacking as much overlapping damage pods as possible to deal the maximum amount of damage you can to those bosses. All right, on to build number 2. We got the Lightning Arrow Deadeye. We're already talking about ranged bow builds here. Well, I know not everyone likes to have things doing damage for you, so if you want to be the one doing damage yourself, this is the build for you. If you want to play an archer, that classic fantasy, this is the build. You're going to zip through the campaign. You can even transition into an endgame version of this build or another bow build with this starter build, because oftentimes in Path of Exile you have your starter build, and that's just there temporarily for you to build your actual endgame character, which either involves literally making another character, or you have to invest a whole lot into fully respecing your character. But with this one, if you want to go an endgame bow build, you don't have to respec all that much. Now, Lightning Arrow is a skill that when you shoot an enemy with an arrow, a lightning bolt then strikes that enemy and other nearby enemies in an area. So this build actually has pretty good area damage. And this build excels at mapping. it's fast, and you can farm efficiently on a mid-range budget. In fact, you're going to have a hard time replicating this build's speed, its clear speed, on any other build at a similar budget. It's easy to level, it's easy to gear, it's solo self-found friendly, and it also scales really well with gear investment into the endgame. Now that said, it can be squishy, not recommended for hardcore players. It's also not great against bosses, it's sacrificing single target damage for clear speed. To help its single target damage, this build works in Artillery Ballista, which summons ballistas that are going to rain fire down on your enemies. To run this class, you start with the Ranger, the Bow Expert, and then you take the Deadeye Ascendancy. This focuses on enhancing your projectiles. Now, while you're playing Lightning Arrow, you want to keep enemies as far away from you as possible because you have a buff from the Ascendancy that makes you deal more damage, makes your projectiles deal more damage the farther they have to travel. That works out well because you don't want enemies near you because you're squishy. On the defensive side, you're pretty safe from one-shot mechanics, but you do have to actively dodge enemies. You are a glass cannon, you cannot just sit and tank. Alright, on to build number 3, the Detonate Dead Elementalist. Detonate Dead is Path of Exile's version of Corpse Explosion. You target a corpse, it goes boom, damaging enemies in an area around it. But unlike in the Diablo 2 days, where when you ran out of corpses, you were basically useless, this build brings its own ammo. The Desecrate spell lets you summon corpses. Now, Detonate Dead's explosion deals a fixed amount of fire damage, then also deals an amount of damage that scales based on the max life of the corpse. So that means as you fight higher level enemies, this build naturally scales up. Enemies have more life, so corpses have more life. So you deal more damage. This makes this build an ideal choice if you don't have to bother with trading or crafting, since you don't need to rely on upgrading a weapon as you rise in level. To run this build, you take the Witch class, that's the basic spellcaster, then you take the Elementalist Ascendancy, which is going to buff that fire damage. This build is a really strong league starter that can tackle any content thrown at it. Mapping, bossing, it could become tanky at endgame, and it offers a super simple 2-button playstyle. Desecrate to spawn corpses, Detonate Dead to make them go boom. Now, before endgame, your defenses are okay. You can't just sit and tank, you do need to avoid getting hit, but you're not a glass cannon. And when you're fighting tougher enemies like certain rares or bosses, the 2-button playstyle becomes a 3-button playstyle. You want to work in Arcanist Brand, which applies a curse to an enemy. And thanks to the Defiled Corpse's notable passive, that's going to refresh any ignite on that enemy, which is the fire damage applied by Detonate Dead. Alright, on to build number 4, the Summon Raging Spirits Guardian. If you want to run a minion build, this is the perfect league starter for you. Summon Raging Spirits is a spell that summons a flaming skull that's going to just charge out at enemies and attack them. These minions only live for a few seconds, so you are very often resummoning them, but you don't have to actively target enemies. You can do it off in a corner, you can be facing away from enemies. These are heat-seeking missiles that are going to go and zero in and strike your enemies. Now, the Guardian Ascendancy and its heavy defenses make this for a very easy leveling experience. Altogether, it's hard to find a smoother progressing build in the game. With low investment, you can get into the end game easily. And the build is also friendly for solo self-found hardcore players. To run this build, you start by picking the Templar class. That's the hybrid intelligence strength class. That's sort of the equivalent of a cleric in other games. Then you take the Guardian Ascendancy, which has a ton of defensive skills and auras that will also buff your minions. This build is really tanky. You'll be immune to freeze and shock. You're going to have really high life regeneration from time of need, which is also going to remove curses cast by enemies and the occasional ailment that gets past your block. And you'll further be able to reduce incoming damage via block, suppression, armor. The build also focuses on automating as much as possible, resulting in a really simple playstyle. You summon your Raging Spirits, then you just breeze through a map, zooming around with Shield Charge and Frostblink. Every 15 seconds, you cast Haste to move faster, and if you want, every 30 seconds, you can summon your Sentinel of Radiance to taunt enemies and further mitigate damage. Then on to build number 5, the Boneshatter Slayer. If you want a melee build, this is your best option. This build revolves around the Boneshatter skill, which is a melee skill that when you hit enemies, some of that damage splashes back onto you. And if you stun enemies with that attack, it sends out a wave of damage, hitting enemies in an area. To dive into the mechanic a little bit more here, when you hit an enemy with Boneshatter, you're going to gain a stack of trauma. Every stack of trauma that you have gives you a small damage buff, which is nice, but you also take physical damage for every trauma stack that you have. Because of this, it's really important to focus on taking things that reduce the amount of physical damage that you take, like armor. Life recovery is also very important to counteract the damage that is getting past your defenses as you're hitting enemies. This build is excellent at clearing maps on a low budget, and it's the fastest melee league starter. It's not good against bosses, but most of your time is being spent in maps anyway. Boneshatter's early and mid game were even buffed this league, but the top end is worse off. To run this build, you start by taking the Duelist, that's the hybrid strength dexterity class. It's great at both dealing and avoiding damage. But then you take the Slayer Ascendancy, which zeroes in on that offensive aspect. This gives you access to a lot of life leech. In fact, you get the ability to life leech beyond your max life, which means the leeching continues, you keep getting life back even once you've stopped hitting enemies. That said, fair warning, this overleech does not persist between zones. So just keep it in mind if you have overleeched and then you click through into a subzone and then you just instantly die. Now, for your offense, you do need to continue to upgrade your weapon. This is your most significant source of damage. That doesn't mean you have to get into the trade game, however. This build is totally solo self-found viable. You can craft everything you need, just follow the max roll guide, they got you covered. Be sure to keep upgrading your weapon regularly as you're going through the campaign, and a few times as well into mapping. Now, on the defensive side, you are incredibly tanky. You might not be able to kill bosses quickly, but you can face tank them until they eventually die. The playstyle is really simple. You use Leap Slam to jump between packs of enemies and stun them, then you bring down that Boneshatter. Against bosses, you'll need to throw down some help via Ancestral Protector and Ancestral Warchief. Alright, on to build number 6. Wait, but I said 5 builds, right? Well, about that. Buy 5 builds, get 1 free? Number 6 is the Boneshatter Juggernaut. So, I didn't feel right saying we have 6 builds when it's really like 5.5. This is just another way to play Boneshatter. To run this version of the build, you start by taking the Marauder class, which is the strength-based warrior class equivalent to a barbarian in other games. Then you take the Juggernaut Ascendancy, which focuses on enhancing your armor and your general survivability. Overall, this is the tankier version of Boneshatter. You're swapping out an offensive ascendancy for a defensive one. You're focusing more on avoiding damage and mitigating it than recovery. So this gives you an easier time negating any of the self-damage from trauma. It does mean, however, it's going to take even longer to kill bosses. But you're basically unkillable. Your only weakness is elemental damage over time, so if a dot pool appears beneath you, just, move a few inches over to get out of there. Also, the Juggernaut variant of Boneshatter does feel the impact of the lessened effectiveness at endgame even more than the Slayer version. Alright, those are our 6 picks. That's going to wrap up this video. Again, maxroll.gg will have updated build guides to all these builds, links in the description. But I turn the question to you folks, what are you going to start with and what league starters do you recommend? This time around, I wanted to suggest league starters that all have max roll guides to follow along with. I know there are other great options and you can feel free to link them and talk about them in the comments. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch, Patreon, and YouTube supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. Check out these other videos and subscribe to join Rhykker's Raiders for more ARPG content.